From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined with our super producer, Paul, Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here. That makes this stuff they don't want you to know. And we are recording on breaking news this time around the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the most recent news as we're recording. On May 8th, 2018, the U.S., the United States, announced that it was withdrawing from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, for those of us who are acronym fans.
I'm a fan.
It's also known as the Iran deal.
Yeah, or the Iran nuclear deal here in the States, right? That's an easy way to explain it in a few syllables on the evening news.
And this decision was met with pretty widespread consternation from some of our allies and fellow participants in this deal. And I guess we're going to go into why that might be.
Yeah, it's certainly a subject that is just rife with complexity.
Yep.
And we're going to look into the history today. We're going to look into what it could mean for everyone involved. And let's talk about the deal itself.
Sure. Yeah, the deal was signed into effect in 2015 by members of the UN's Permanent Security Council, essentially the winning side of World War II, plus Germany and the EU as its own entity, and then Iran and the United States, which was, part of the Permanent Security Council, but they're one of the main actors in today's episode. In exchange for freezing aspects of Iran's nuclear enrichment program and submitting to intense, historically unprecedented investigation programs on site in the country, Iran would receive partial sanctions relief. This would allow the economically strapped country access to billions of dollars, both in terms of potential billions of dollars for trade and in terms of billions of dollars of real-world money that have been held frozen offshore by foreign powers like the European Union and the United States.
I'm a big dummy. When we say sanctions, that can mean a couple different things. What does it mean in this particular situation? Is it like a trade, like barring of trade?
Great question. Yeah, because again, for those of us who just hear these terms thrown around in the news, they're not often explained. So sanctions are, in general, penalties for breaking a law or an agreement, just in general. You can give someone a sanction yourself, should you somehow convince them you have the authority to do it. In the geopolitical sense, however, sanctions are part of what we would call sticks and carrots of diplomacy. A carrot is an incentive. We will give you X amount of dollars to do what we want, or we will give you this nuclear hardware or these chemical agents.
It is based around trade.
Right.
Most of the time.
Most of the time, yeah, thank God, today.
Yeah.
Military actions can also be considered sanctions depending on how they're rationalized.
It could be something like imposing penalties or making it less profitable to do business, kind of.
Or impossible.
Yeah.
Right. So typically when we hear the phrase sanctions apply, what we're talking about is a genre of sanctions called economic sanctions. I mentioned the carrots earlier. Economic sanctions are a form of stick, a form of punishment. So not enticing a state to change its behavior, but attempting to force it to do so. The role of sanctions in this conflict cannot be overstated, and it's primarily due to the actions of the United States. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that can unilaterally apply sanctions. They can take their toys, they can leave the playground, and now no one else can play. That has been the case for a long time, and that's a vast oversimplification, but here's how it works. When the U.S. wants to sanction a country, it helps if they have an alliance with other allies, but if they decide to go it alone, they can still screw up the entire Rube Goldberg-esque thing that is international trade. Let's say they do an economic sanction regime wherein they say no U.S.-based businesses, so no like Boeing, no Lockheed Martin,
Northrop Grumman.
No financial institutions can economically interact with a certain country or with trades involving that country. At first, that sounds like, okay, U.S. is leaving the game. There are more fish in the sea, there are more badgers in the bag, but the problem is almost all financial interactions at that level, at some point in the chain, travel through a U.S. financial institution, and once they do, the money stops. The bubble pops. And on the ground, this means that a sanctioned country literally cannot buy or sell certain things, not just weapons of war, but things like medical equipment, industrial components. Stuff like, let's say you have an ice cream factory and you need a large enough boiler for some reason. Obviously, we have not researched ice cream factories. But if that specific component falls under this sanction, then it becomes very, very difficult for you to buy it. So when Cuba, for instance, had sanctions during the Cold War, it was not able to get life-saving medical equipment. And that's why if you travel to Cuba today, as some of my contacts had recently, and you tour their hospitals, several very important pieces of equipment in the hospital are going to be German stuff from the 50s, because that's all they could get. Mm-hmm. These hospitals, by the way, are not air-conditioned, just to illustrate that.
Man.
So the whole point with this deal that went through, it was very difficult for it to actually happen.
Right.
And it happened in the previous administration under President Obama. And if you look at the agreement itself, there are all kinds of things that have problems with it, at least that either side would say, this is kind of a big deal.
Well, that's how you know it's a compromise, right?
Yeah, exactly.
'Cause no one's entirely happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Matt, you're absolutely right. It took a long time to get everyone to the table first and then to achieve anything. Most of the global community was completely appalled to see the U.S. withdraw, although under U.S. law, it is legal to do so, because our side of this agreement was what's called an executive order. It was not ratified by Congress. Mm-hmm. And because it's an executive order, that means whomever occupies the position of commander-in-chief afterwards can just get rid of it without running it past Congress or the American people. And there was international support for this deal, primarily U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, who are also the key regional rivals of Iran. They applauded the move. They said this is a way to prevent nuclear war.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of this has to do with these things called sunset clauses, which were built into the agreement itself, and specifically with the enrichment process and which centrifuges could be used at what time. I think there was like an 8-year, what they called sunset clause, where after 8 years, they could then begin enriching uranium with these new versions of their centrifuges.
Fire them back up. Much more efficient.
Yeah, exactly. But the whole idea was that the people who are fighting against us being in this deal were saying they're just using these sunset clauses to then be able to achieve nuclear weapons anyway.
Or they're secretly still conducting these things despite the investigations.
But isn't their argument that they're just doing this to have nuclear power like we do?
Everybody's argument is that that's the thing. Yeah. Everybody's argument is that we are only pursuing nuclear capabilities to replace fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's since before a nuclear weapon was even devised.
Sure.
And it's tricky because when you study this kind of stuff, the enrichment process for a weapon and for a power plant are identical. The only difference is the degree of enrichment.
How long do you do it?
Just keep going.
Yep.
And that regardless of what side you fall on, that's a huge dilemma. North Korea, for instance, when you speak with North Korean diplomats for years and years and years, they were saying that they were peacefully pursuing nuclear power as a means of economic independence, not as a means of starting war. And who believed them? No one. No one would believe the U.S. if they said that.